Hello and welcome to another CHSG History revision video. This one focuses on the interpretations questions which are found on paper 3. Let's start by reminding ourselves the difference between sources and interpretations. When we talk about sources, we mean items which were made or left behind by people in the past who were living through events at the time. For example, a soldier in the trenches might leave behind a diary, or we might find the remains of a shield which belonged to a Roman soldier. An interpretation is not the same. An interpretation is someone's view or opinion about the past. It was made by someone who was not there at the time and did not take part in the events. For example, a historian might write a book about ancient Rome, or a movie director might make a film showing his view of the trenches, like the film War Horse. Because interpretations and sources are different, we need to take a different approach to them. In this video, we're going to look at how to evaluate an interpretation. Here's one of the interpretations we're going to practice on. Because this is an interpretation, not a source, we are not interested in who made it or where it comes from. We're going to focus on only the content, in other words, what it says. First, let's look at an overview of question 3. It comes in 4 parts. You should do them in order from A to D. The paper will lead you through towards the big 16-mark evaluating interpretations question at the end. In this video, we'll look at the interpretations questions 3B, 3C and 3D. You can watch other videos on our channel about source evaluation. The first interpretations question is 3B. Here we need to compare two interpretations. This means explaining what the main difference between them is. As you can see, this is a short answer worth just 4 marks, so we want no more than 4 sentences. Here are 2 interpretations we're going to use to demonstrate this. You should pause the video and read these carefully before going any further. Here is one good method for doing this question. A successful student will memorise this method so that they can use it in the exam independently for themselves. We start by underlining the question focus so that we stay on the right topic. In this case, the focus is Nazi methods of controlling people in the years 1933 to 39. Now, I'm already thinking about what I know about that topic. I know the Nazis controlled people with censorship, banning information which they did not want the public to have. They also used propaganda to influence the public with Nazi ideas. They developed an extensive police state to arrest opposition and terrorise the population. Another way of controlling people was through pressuring them to join Nazi organisations for workers, women and young people. Next, I prepare the interpretations by reading them, looking for a big difference of opinion. Now, we're not looking for a tiny detail here. The interpretations will disagree about something big or have a different focus altogether. In this case, I've noticed that interpretation 1 is focused on propaganda. I'll need a quote to prove that. I'll take this one about radio propaganda. On the other hand, interpretation 2 is more focused on the police state. I'll take this quote about people being imprisoned without trial. Now I'm ready to write my answer. I start with a sentence summarising the main difference. Then I summarise the view in interpretation 1. And I support this with a direct quote from the interpretation. Note my use of quotation marks here. Then I do exactly the same for the other interpretation. Because I'm about to compare this to the other interpretation, I'll use the word whereas. I summarise the interpretation and then support it with a quote. Take special note of the key phrases which help us to answer this question effectively in just a few sentences. Now, question 3C requires us to explain the interpretations, and this means saying why they are different. Again, it's a short question, so we only want to spend 4 minutes and write 4 sentences on this. You should also notice that for this question, you've been given 2 sources to use. Pause the video and read these before you go any further. When we're explaining interpretations, here's one method we can use. As before, you should memorise this method so that you can do it independently yourself. We start by underlining the question focus. It will be the same as the previous question. So once again, we're focusing on Nazi methods of controlling people, 1933 to 39. Now we prepare the sources. We have to match each source with one of the interpretations. The match is usually quite obvious. In this case, source A is about reporting people to the police, so it matches with interpretation 2 about the police state. I'll underline a quote in the source about reporting people to use in my answer. Source B is about radio propaganda, so it matches with interpretation 1. Because the source is a photo, I'll pick something from the content of the photo to use in my answer. In this case, Goebbels' radio script. And now I can write my answer. The first sentence of my answer to 3C is always the same. I'm going to say the interpretations differ because they place weight on different evidence. You need to memorise this sentence because you'll use it every time you do question 3C, including in the exam. Now I summarise the view in interpretation 1. And I link it to the source, providing a quote or detail from the source to prove that I'm right. Because I'm about to compare this to the other interpretation, I'll use the word whereas. Then I do exactly the same with the other interpretation. This is the bit for you to complete and have a go at yourself. Finally, we come to question 3D. This requires us to evaluate the interpretations. This means deciding how true they are. This question is worth 16 marks, plus an extra 4 marks for specialist terminology, punctuation and grammar. We should allow around 30 minutes to do it well, and our answer will have 2 main sections plus a conclusion. The question always starts with, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about? But we must evaluate both interpretations in our answer, and that's really important. So don't just write about interpretation 2, write about both of them. Here's one method for tackling this question. A successful GCSE historian will know this method off by heart. To show you how to use the method, I'm going to work through it step by step. And here's the question we're going to practice on. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about Nazi methods of controlling people in the years 1933 to 39? Now, because the question says, how far do you agree with interpretation 2, we know we need to evaluate the interpretation. This means we have to decide how good or how true the interpretation is. We will write about what the interpretation gets right and what it gets wrong. In other words, the strengths and limitations of the interpretation. And remember, we have to cover both interpretations in our answer. The first step is to underline the focus of the question. We do this to make sure we stick to what we've been asked to write about. In this case, the focus is again Nazi methods of control, 1933 to 39. We need to decide whether the interpretation gives a true, full view of that topic. The next step is to prepare both the interpretations. This means I need to read them, summarise them, underline useful and relevant quotes, and I need to decide which one is the best. Now, to decide which one is the best, here are three things that I might consider. Firstly, how accurate is the interpretation? Is it true, or does it contain something which is wrong? Secondly, how complete is the interpretation? Does it cover the whole topic, or has it left out something important? Thirdly, has the interpretation exaggerated something? This means, has it overstated how important something is? Let's do interpretation 1 first. I'll read it. Then I'll summarise it. This means I write a sentence which summarises the main point. In this case, the interpretation focuses on propaganda. Next, I'll underline any points or quotes which are relevant to that. Now, I'm particularly looking for quotes which I can develop with my own knowledge, and you can see I've chosen a few here. Now, although I might not have time to write this in the exam, I'm already starting to think of the strengths and weaknesses of this interpretation. I think it's right about propaganda, and I have some knowledge about radios and rallies that I can use to support it. I also think the interpretation is right that propaganda was important, because I know it reached a wide audience. But one thing I slightly disagree with is where the interpretation says that propaganda was subtle. I disagree with that a bit because some of the propaganda was not subtle at all. For example, the Nazis' anti-Semitic films, which encouraged hatred of the Jews. Let's do interpretation 2 next. After reading it, I'll summarise it. Next, I'll underline any points or quotes which are relevant to that. Again, I'm particularly looking for quotes which I can develop with my own knowledge. And I'm already starting to think of the strengths and limitations of this interpretation. I think it's right about how the Nazis used their powers to ban political parties and created a secret police force and concentration camps to remove opponents. And I've got some knowledge I can use to develop that in my answer. But I've thought of some really big limitations of this interpretation. I think it's exaggerating the power of the police state a little bit. I know the police state was not very efficient and that terror affected less people than propaganda. So I'm going to decide which interpretation I think is best, and I'll tick it. In this case, I think interpretation 1 is better. Propaganda, in my view, was more important in controlling people in the years 1933 to 39. And I'm ready to write my answer now. I'll start with interpretation 2, as that was the interpretation named in the question. I'll start off my first main section by summarising it. Then I'll analyse the interpretation. This means I will select a quote from it, like this one, note my quotation marks. Then I'll explain what my quote means. As you can see, I've added another quote here. Note those quotation marks again. And then I've explained it in my own words. Now, we're picking up marks when we quote and explain in this way, so we need to work through this process several times. Now you have a go at adding some quotes from the interpretation and explaining them. Beginning with the word furthermore is a good way of showing that we're going to add more quotes. Note the key phrases which we use when we're analysing the interpretation in this way. These need to be in your analysis as well. Next, it's time to evaluate the interpretation. This means we need to judge how good or how true the interpretation is. We need to consider both the strengths and limitations of the interpretation. Now, we always start with the strengths. To do this, we need to support the interpretation with some of our own detailed knowledge. One point in the interpretation which I know is accurate is the way the Nazis banned other political parties. I'll add some of my own specific knowledge about that to support the interpretation. And I'm going to explain why this is important and link it back to the interpretation to make sure I'm answering the question I was given. And now it's your turn to add some more knowledge of your own to support the interpretation. Perhaps you could write about the role of the Gestapo, the legal system, or the way the Nazis took control of the churches and persecuted leading members of the clergy, like Martin Niemöller, for example. When you do it, don't forget to use these key phrases in your work. Part of evaluating means also considering whether there are any limitations of the interpretation. To let my reader know that I'm about to switch from the positives to the limitations, I'll use the word however. Now remember, there are three main limitations that I could write about. Firstly, the interpretation may not be accurate, so it might have something wrong in it. Secondly, it may not be complete, so it might be missing something important. And thirdly, it may have exaggeration, so it might overemphasize the importance of something. I'm going to focus on something which has been exaggerated in the interpretation. In this case, I think it has overemphasized the power of the police state. Now I need to support my idea with some of my own detailed specific knowledge. I'm going to point out that there were not actually very many Gestapo agents in a country of millions of people. And I'm going to explain why this is important and link it back to the interpretation to make sure I'm answering the question I was given. As you can see, I'm making it absolutely clear here that this knowledge challenges the interpretation. I'm going to add another limitation. Notice that I'm using that word furthermore again, because I'm about to continue with another example of something that the interpretation is not right about. It's over to you to continue this bit, but here are a couple of other limitations you could write about. Don't forget to use these key phrases to help you focus on answering the question. When it gets to the end of this part of the answer, our first main section, we need to reach a judgment. This needs to make a decision about how far we agree with the interpretation. Let the reader know that you're reaching a judgment by using the word thus. Now, say to what extent you agree with the interpretation. I've gone for moderate, but we could swap that word out for something like great or limited or partial to fit our view. And now I need to give my winning reason why. As you can see, this should be a short one-sentence judgment. Now remember, you absolutely must write about both interpretations in your answer. So now it's time for you to have a go at the other interpretation. Start by summarising it. Then analyse it by taking some quotes and explaining them. Evaluate it by supporting it with your own knowledge and by explaining any limitations you can find. Then reach a judgment. Once you've written your two main sections, one on each interpretation, you're ready for your short conclusion. Now this will just be 3 or 4 sentences. Start by giving your overall decision about interpretation 2, because that was the interpretation you were asked about in the question. The phrase on balance lets your reader know that you're about to conclude your answer. Because interpretation 2 was not my preferred interpretation, I've decided to agree with it to a limited extent. Next, give a counterpoint. This means you need to point out what the best point is on the other side of the argument. In other words, what is the strongest point against your decision? Then use the word however to let your reader know you're about to give your winning point. End with your winning reason. In this case, I think interpretation 2 has some really severe limitations, so interpretation 1 is better. Notice the key phrases that we use to structure our conclusion. Now we've reached the end of the method, look back at the 4 steps we went through. One way of improving our exam technique is to memorise this method and practice it frequently so that we can do it independently. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and take a look at our other GCSE history videos.